Ever get that feeling? Like someone's reaching right into your pocket and they're just taking your hard-earned money.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Well, that's kind of what Ron Paul taps into in his book, And the Fed.
It's a pretty provocative title, right?
It is, and it takes direct aim at the core of, well, the whole American financial system.
Ron Paul, he was a congressman for, like, forever, and a presidential candidate, too. And he's known for being a libertarian, that's for sure. But I think he's even more famous for just how much he dislikes the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, he really doesn't like the Fed. And end the Fed, it's not just some polite disagreement either.
Oh, no.
It's like a full-on, let's get rid of this thing kind of statement.
Completely abolish it.
Yeah, and he published it right in the middle of the financial crisis, 2009.
Wow, so right when tons of people were already questioning the Fed?
Exactly. There was so much anger, so much distrust in the whole system.
Perfect timing for a book like this to come out then.
For sure. So today, we're going to dive into Paul's arguments, see what kind of impact this book has had and what it all means for, our everyday financial lives.
Sounds good.
Now, Paul comes at this from a unique perspective because he's actually a doctor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, an OBGYN to be specific.
Huh. So how does that, translate to economics?
Well, Paul talks about how being a doctor gave him a different way of looking at life, at value.
Okay.
And in the end, at economics too.
I see.
He sees the economy kind of like a living thing, something where if you mess with it too much, you might not like the results.
Like unintended consequences.
Exactly. So it's kind of like he's applying that whole do no harm thing to, the financial world.
Interesting.
And in his eyes, the biggest troublemaker is the Federal Reserve. So lay it on us, what's his main problem with the Fed?
Well, Paul's core argument is this. The Federal Reserve, it's undemocratic, it's unconstitutional, and ultimately it's really hurting the American economy.
So he's saying it's rigged against the average person.
Pretty much. Like it favors the elites,
Right. And he even points back to the very beginning of the Fed, how it got started.
Ah, you mean that whole secretive meeting on Jekyll Island?
Exactly.
Back in 1910?
Powerful bankers all getting together in secret, plotting to create this whole central banking system.
It's like something out of a movie.
Right.
So Paul's kind of using that, tapping into that suspicion people have about, powerful people making decisions behind closed doors.
Decisions that affect all of us.
Right.
And to back up his point, he brings in historical figures, like Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, right. Jefferson was really against central banking.
Yep. He saw it as a threat to liberty, to individual freedom. So Paul's framing his argument as kind of defending what the founding fathers wanted.
I see. He's trying to give it historical weight.
Exactly. So it's not just Paul's opinion. He's saying it goes against, the very foundation of America.
Smart strategy. But, okay, let's get practical here. What does he actually think we should do about it?
Well, he's got a solution, but it's a pretty radical one.
I'm listening.
He says, get rid of the Federal Reserve completely. Abolish it.
Wow. Just like that.
Just like that.
Hmm.
And he wants to go back to a system where money is backed by something real, something tangible.
Like gold.
Gold, silver, something like that. He thinks that would make things more stable, less prone to manipulation.
So back to the gold standard, huh? Some people might see that as kind of old-fashioned.
They might.
Definitely a big change. How would that even work? Like, practically speaking, wouldn't that just throw everything into chaos?
It's a good question. And even some of Paul's supporters are skeptical about whether that's actually doable. A lot of economists would say tying our currency to gold, it's just too rigid.
Too inflexible.
Yeah, especially in today's world with, the global economy and everything.
Right.
But for Paul, the gold standard, it's about limiting the government's power. Because right now, they can devalue your savings through inflation.
And that affects everyone listening, right?
It does. It hits everyone's wallet.
So how does that work, this whole inflation thing?
Well, Paul calls inflation a hidden tax. So when the government prints more money, the value of each dollar you have goes down.
Oh, I get it.
Even if you're making the same amount of money, you can actually buy less with it.
So you're getting poorer even if your income stays the same.
Exactly. It's like running on a treadmill. You're working just as hard, but you're not getting anywhere.
That's a good way to put it.
And Paul says the people who get hit hardest by inflation are the poor and those on fixed income, because they have less flexibility, right? It's harder for them to adjust to rising prices.
And their savings just disappear faster.
Exactly. So we've got this hidden tax eating away at our purchasing power.
Right.
And Paul says this is all tied to the Fed having a monopoly on creating money.
So he's saying the Fed has too much power.
Exactly. Too much power and not enough oversight. He thinks it leads to corruption, manipulation, all that.
So the Fed's making decisions that help the government and the big banks but hurt everyone else.
That's his argument.
Hey there, listeners. If you're finding value in our deep dives and want to dig even deeper, consider grabbing a copy through the Amazon link in the description below. And if you're an audiobook fan, you can dive in with a free 2-month Audible trial on us. Our gift to you. It's a great way to support the channel, explore amazing works on the go, and immerse yourself in these thought-provoking ideas. So, check out those links in the description, and thank you for supporting our work. And we'll keep the deep dives coming.
And he doesn't stop there. He also connects the Fed to these boom and bust cycles that we've seen in the economy for decades.
Oh, that's interesting. How does he make that connection?
He says the Fed manipulates interest rates. You know, those numbers that determine how much it costs to borrow money.
Right.
And he says those manipulations, they create these artificial bubbles in the economy.
Bubbles that eventually burst.
Always. And when they do, everyone feels the pain.
Like with the housing crisis back in 2008.
Exactly.
The housing bubble.
That's the one. Paul says the Fed kept interest rates artificially low, so it was super easy to get a mortgage, even if you couldn't really afford it.
Which led to all this risky lending and borrowing.
Yep. It fueled this massive housing bubble that had to burst eventually.
And when it did, it brought the whole economy down with it.
And Paul's saying, if we didn't have the Fed meddling in things, the market would regulate itself.
Leading to more stable growth.
That's what he believes.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, a lot of economists disagree with him on that. They think the Fed's role is crucial, especially when things go bad.
Right, to kind of smooth things out.
Yeah. So it's a complicated issue, for sure. But Paul's making us ask some important questions, like, could we actually have a more resilient economy without a central bank?
Something to think about. But Paul doesn't just stop at criticizing the Fed's, monetary policies. He also goes after the Fed's role in, enabling government overspending, especially when it comes to wars and expanding social programs.
So this is where his libertarian philosophy really comes in.
Right. He sees government intervention in the economy as, inherently bad, and he thinks the Fed is the key to making all that intervention possible.
So instead of the government having to make tough decisions like raising taxes or cutting spending, they can just keep writing checks.
Because the Fed can just create more money.
Exactly. And Paul's very worried about the long-term effects of that.
He sees it leading to a huge national debt. And that debt, eventually, someone's going to have to pay for it.
Future generations.
Right. It's like giving a teenager a credit card. Things might look great at first, but eventually, that bill comes due.
Makes sense. So basically, Paul's argument is all about distrusting unchecked power, whether it's politicians or central bankers.
He thinks the Fed has too much power and too little accountability.
And that they operate in secret.
Exactly. And that's what I think makes his book so interesting. It really gets you thinking differently about money, about central banks, about what happens when the government gets too involved in the economy.
Whether you agree with him or not, he makes you question things.
He does. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the impact of the book.
Okay.
And the Fed didn't just, sit on bookshelves. It really started a conversation that's still going on today.
It definitely struck a nerve. And I think it really captured what people were feeling after the financial crisis. They were looking for answers, for someone to blame.
And Paul pointed the finger right at the Fed.
And his book, it tapped into this anger, this distrust of the elites. And that feeling was already brewing even before things like the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street happened.
He was talking about these issues way before they became mainstream.
Things like income inequality, the power of the wealthy. He was talking about all that years ago.
He was ahead of his time in a way.
And he said it all with this clarity and passion that really resonated with people, especially young people and libertarians who were already drawn to his message of individual freedom and limited government.
He seems to appeal to different groups of people at different times.
I mean, in 2009, it was people hurting from the financial crisis.
Makes sense.
But today, his ideas about central banking and government overreach, they're resonating with folks worried about things like inflation.
And cryptocurrency.
Exactly. That desire for alternatives to, traditional money.
Right. Something outside the control of the government.
And that's a direct response to what Paul's been saying for years.
So even if not everyone agrees with his solutions, his ideas are still relevant today.
And End the Fed It wasn't just some theoretical book. It actually led to real action, like the push to audit the Fed. Kept introducing bills in Congress, demanding more transparency from the Fed.
He wanted to know what they were doing behind closed doors.
He said, this institution has so much power over the economy, the American people deserve to know what's going on.
And did he succeed? Did they ever fully audit the Fed?
Not completely, but his efforts did make a difference. He sponsored this bill called the Federal Reserve Transparency Act.
Back in 2009.
Yeah. And while it didn't lead to a full audit, it did force the Fed to disclose more information.
Like what kind of information?
Stuff about their emergency lending programs during the financial crisis.
So they had to be more open about how they were using taxpayer money.
Exactly. And that shows how powerful Paul's ideas were.
He mobilized a whole movement.
He did, and that movement actually had an impact on policy, even if it didn't accomplish everything it wanted.
Impressive.
And his legacy continues today, not just in these debates about monetary policy, but also through his son, Senator Rand Paul.
He's picked up the mantle.
He's still challenging the Fed's authority, trying to limit its power. So Ron Paul's ideas are still very much alive.
They have shaped the conversation about central banking in a big way.
They have. So even though End the Fed came out back in 2009, the conversation it started is far from over.
It goes beyond just the technical stuff about monetary policy.
Right. It gets into these bigger questions about the role of government, individual freedom, the nature of money itself.
It's a call to action almost.
He's asking us to rethink the status quo, to challenge our assumptions, and to consider alternatives.
Whether you agree with his solutions or not, it's a thought-provoking book.
It is. So as we wrap up, I'm curious, what stood out to you most about Paul's argument?
You know, I think what's really interesting is how he connects these complex economic ideas to everyday life. He makes them relatable. That whole thing about inflation being a hidden tax, it makes you realize that economic policy isn't just some abstract thing.
Right. It affects all of us.
It affects how much money you have in your pocket, your ability to save for the future, to provide for your family.
He brings it home, that's for sure. It's not just some debate happening among academics. It's about real people's lives.
Exactly. And even if you think his solutions are too radical, he's asking some really important questions.
About the role of money in central banks.
Yeah, in a free society. Questions that we need to think about seriously, even if we don't agree with his answers.
Right. It's a good thought experiment. What if we were designing a financial system from scratch today? Would we still create something like the Federal Reserve?
Or would we choose something different?
Exactly. That's the challenge Ron Paul throws down and the Fed. It's not just criticism. It's an invitation to imagine something new.
To envision a world where the power to create and control money isn't concentrated in one place.
Right. So let's play that game. If Ron Paul got his way and the Fed was gone tomorrow, what would that actually mean? For you, for me, for everyone?
Well, it's hard to say for sure what would happen, but Paul's vision, it points to a world where the government has less control over the economy.
So market forces would have a bigger impact.
Yeah, on things like the value of money, the cost of borrowing.
So less government, but potentially more risk and uncertainty in the markets.
Potentially, it's a trade-off for sure.
And people would have different reactions to that.
Definitely. Some would like the idea of a more decentralized system, you know? One that's free from the control of central bankers.
Like a pure form of capitalism.
Exactly. Where the risks and the rewards are more closely aligned.
But others might be afraid of all that uncertainty.
Oh yeah. They might worry about inflation getting out of control or even another Great Depression. It's a complicated issue and there's no easy answers.
But that's why it's so important to have this conversation. To weigh the pros and cons of a world without a central bank. And the Fed forces us to confront those tough questions, to think critically about the systems that run our economy.
And whether those systems are really working for us. It's a book that will make you think, that's for sure.
And maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire some of you to come up with your own solutions.
Solutions that are even better than Ron Paul's. So if the Fed disappeared tomorrow, what would you want to see in its place?
Good question to think about.
We encourage all of you to explore this topic further, to look at it from different angles, and to come to your own conclusions.
And if you want to dig deeper into Ron Paul's arguments, you can find a link to his book, End the Fed, in the description below.
And be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into fascinating and thought-provoking topics. We'll see you next time.